I've got some terms on the board that this chapter starts with, because the author begins with some reflections about how Islam has been perceived or treated in the United States. Like he says, of all the major religious traditions represented in the United States, Islam is probably the one that many Americans have the greatest difficulty understanding. And it's not because it's inherently difficult to understand or because of its complexity, although there's, like any historical religion, quite a lot of complexity. It has to do with other factors, which were exacerbated, bless you, by 9/11 and by the reactions back and forth about that. But we're already there, as part of American and Western culture in general. So, like he says, a lot of Americans have been accustomed to think about religion in what he calls binary terms. So you guys are all familiar with binary code, off, on, 0, 1. Any computer science majors in here? No?
Yes, but not computer science exactly.
But
yeah,
everyone gets the basic conception. And when you have binary things, it's black, white, off, on, good, bad. And he talks about this category of the other. And the other in American history has changed as people became part of the mainstream or part of the consensus. So originally Catholics were, the other for Protestants here in the United States. You look at the Puritans, they really didn't like the Church of England, but they really didn't like the Church of England because it looked too much like the Catholic Church, which was going to attempt to impose, some sort of theocracy upon them. So they founded their own theocracy as a response to that. As different Protestant denominations became part of the consensus in America, first it was Catholics, and then it was Mormons. Jews were a sort of perennial other category. But they actually, by the 1950s, as far as Catholics and Jews were concerned, became part of the consensus. We've looked at that story. So now, somebody, very few Catholics do this anymore, but if somebody crosses themselves and says grace before meals, nobody's going to drop the salt and say, oh my God, the Catholics are here. Islam is in a different stage as far as that. So Islam has become sort of the other par excellence. And he brings up a very popular social theorist, Edward Said, who talks about Orientalism. Orientalism is this attitude that he discerns in the West, and America was part of the West, which sort of displaces everything that's dangerous or irrational onto the East, onto the Orient. And he uses the word Orientalism because you're not supposed to use Oriental anymore. It's a non-PC term. And like he said, like the book notes, these negative or ambiguous associations with the Orient have been reinforced by various hostile acts, disruption of an Olympics, air hijackings, the Iranian Revolution, and the hostage crisis, which occurred when I was a kid. I remember what a huge effect that had on Americans out in the Midwest, even, didn't know anybody there, but we felt sort of viscerally affected by it. And he points out that there's two things important to keep in mind. One is that the sort of otherness, or if we want to use the technical term for this in religious studies and philosophy, alterity. This alterity is different than that evoked by Hindus or Buddhists or other, quote, non-Western religions, in part because Islam is a Western religion. It is, from the same sort of root and stock as Judaism and Christianity. It's coming from the Middle East, which is where all three of those religions originated. It has a lot in common with them, much more than, say, Buddhism or Hinduism, or if we want to pick other, as they lump them into this category, Eastern religions like Taoism or Confucianism have. And so oftentimes, what we see is what he calls, invoking Freud, the narcissism of small differences. It's in part because Islam is historically so close to Christianity and Judaism that it can seem at other times so distant. Interestingly, when Islam first came on the scene, it wasn't recognized by most Christians as being a new religion. They just thought, oh, this is another Arian heresy. For centuries, many of them thought that. And then, it came to be recognized as its, own separate sort of thing. The other thing that he points out is, who do we tend to associate Islam with here in the United States? What ethnicity? Yeah.
Mostly Arab.
Yeah. And, there are some reasons to associate Arab ethnicity with Islam. For example, the Quran is written in Arabic. The Hadith are written in Arabic. Many of the important legal schools carried out all their writings in Arabic. But are Arabs the majority of Muslims worldwide? No. The largest Muslim country is actually, if I remember right, Indonesia. And are Arabs the majority of Muslims in the United States? No. As a matter of fact, the majority of Arabs in the United States are actually Christians. Maronite Catholics would be an example of them. The Syrian Church of the East, not exactly Arabic, but they get lumped into the same category. So those are all things to keep in mind. Now, he talks about, I won't put all of these up on the board. He talks about Islam in terms of 6 elements of faith and then the 5 pillars. We'll put the 5 pillars up in a moment, but the 6 elements of faith would be, radical monotheism. There is no God, but God, Allah. Allah is the Arabic word for God. Angels, God's message to humanity contained in a book, the Quran. The Prophet Muhammad being the last of the prophets, the seal, as they say, of the prophets. A resurrection and judgment at the end of time. And all human events being shaped by measuring out, by some sort of providential ordering of human affairs. Now, what in this sounds radically different than... Here's a good compare and contrast. What in this sounds radically different from Judaism or Christianity? Where are the sticking points? Is it the monotheism? Well, for, Muslims have a problem with the Trinity that most Christians want to endorse. But most Christians have some sort of take on the Trinity where, although God is 3, God is also still 1. Right? Is it the notion of angels? Do Jews and Christians not believe in angels? The liberal, ones who want to explain everything in terms of culture or things like that, they may not believe in them, but most traditional Jews and Christians do. What about the notion of God revealing things to human beings? Is that a problem? Not really. The book, which book is it? That would be one of the sticking points, right? Christians, you're not going to see too many of them reading the Quran. Interestingly, one of my copies of it, the one with the Arabic on one side and English on the other, I got from a priest who was spending his time studying it. The Prophet Muhammad, okay, that's going to be a divisive thing because he's coming later. But Muhammad is seen by Muslims as being the last of the whole succession of prophets, of people coming to speak. What about the notion of resurrection or judgment? Is that a major issue for most Jews and Christians? They kind of insist on that, don't they? Think about the Nicene Creed. I believe in the XYZ, comes towards the end, resurrection of the dead. I guess they all have that in common. So let's look at the 5 pillars, because this is something where we have a bit more distinctiveness. 2, 3. So the first pillar is what you can call the Shahada, or a creedal statement. There is no God, but Allah. It's a reaffirmation of monotheism, of radical monotheism. Implicit in that would go that one ought not to engage in idolatry or shirk, making something else God. This will be a really silly instance, but let's say I was like a super coffee connoisseur. If I was, I wouldn't be going to Starbucks because their coffee isn't great. But let's say I was, right, and I bow down and worship this. Well, that would be idolatry. It would be doing something which is not in itself bad, because there is a right object for it, God, but it would be doing something towards not God. Or what if I did that towards myself? The self, the center of the universe. That would be a problem as well. Salat, which is ritual prayer. 5 times daily. There's actually interesting discussions about why 5 times, that, you can, if you want to go into the literature, you can find some of those discussed. The idea is that one ought to bring God to mind 5 times at least. Ideally, one does it more often than that, but 5 times at least during the day. One shows one's submission to the divine will. And this takes place individually. It also takes place communally through the services in a masjid or mosque. Almsgiving. Or what's another word that we use for almsgiving? We don't often go around and say, would you like to give some alms? Yeah.
Isn't it like when you give something to the poor?
Yeah. And what do we call that more often these days?
Charity.
Exactly. Charity is a good translation of zakat. And in some Muslim countries, this is just done by a tax. You're living there, you automatically pay it, it's not an issue. Here in the United States, Muslims would do this in large part by, instead of walking around just doling out money to somebody on the street, you give it to an Islamic charity. Sort of like, if you're in any sort of American office, sooner or later somebody's going to hit you up for the United Way or some other thing like that. Well, there's Muslim charities out there that do things like provide relief in Muslim countries for earthquakes, for political instability that results in refugees or things like that. What else? Fasting. Fasting during the month of Ramadan. And fasting is pretty hardcore. When I taught in Indiana State Prison, some of my students were actually Sunni Muslims, and it was really tough for them because the fast means nothing goes into your mouth. Nothing passes through the lips. No water, no food, not gum, no tobacco, of course. So from sunup to sundown, nothing. And once sundown comes around, sometimes you're locked into your cell and you can't get too much of anything anyway. So for quite a few of these guys, it was quite a hardship. There's interesting issues that have come up, like about NBA players who are Muslims. Do they observe the fast even though it's going to be kind of tough on the body? Imagine playing a hardcore sport and you can't take a sip out of your water bottle till after sundown. Now, if I have all-night games, not a problem, right? But it can be put off, in case of somebody being sick or being, traveling or at war. But it has to be made up later on. And part of this is to assert discipline over the body. This sort of asceticism is common in many religious traditions. Christian monastics would engage in fasting. Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, the other Eastern Christians, at least on paper, still fast during certain periods of the year, like for example Lent. For Catholics, they've actually made it so easy that it's almost not even really fast. But in the old days, one would fast all of Lent. One would reduce one's intake of things. And Ramadan is seen as a particularly propitious time for spiritual development and prayer. And then finally, we've talked about this before. Remember when we talked about Malcolm X? The pilgrimage. The Hajj. One should go to Mecca, and ideally to some of the other holy cities as well, and trace out the path that the Prophet Muhammad, who's seen as sort of like the ideal human being. That's why they're interested in what he had to say. One goes and does this as part of a communal experience, and it involves, at high times, literally millions of people are involved in this pilgrimage, ultimately culminating in swirling around the Kaaba, this central stone. Now, your book also talks about jihad. That's something that's important to think about. And you'll get two different sort of takes on this, both of which are equally wrong by quite a few people, because they're oversimplifications. One is jihad means holy war. So every Muslim is supposed to be carrying out war on the infidel or the unbeliever. Clearly that's not the case, although some people interpret jihad in that way. Other people will go the other way and they'll say, no, jihad means purely this spiritual self-overcoming. No, it also does mean holy war. It means both of these. It means everything in between. It means struggle, and struggle can take all these different forms. So it runs the gamut from that. And then your book starts talking about how Muslims adapt to life in the United States. So what are some of the issues that would make things not impossible but difficult? So diet is one of these. Islam, like traditional Judaism, forbids the eating of pork, and there's a lot of other little rules about what is allowed to be eaten. As a matter of fact, if you can't find a halal that is acceptable, designated, place to eat, place to buy your food, one substitute for that is kosher designations. So Muslims, will sometimes buy kosher products if they can't find things that are actually designated as halal. Finding time for evening prayer can be an issue as well. As a matter of fact, again, to talk about Indiana State Prison, when I was teaching there, this praying 5 times a day, sometimes that would occur during class time. And we were told not to let the students out for that. I never, prevented them. I would say, you're going off to go to the bathroom, and then let them do it. In part because I didn't want to impose a burden on them. But, this could be a real issue if you're in a workplace where you can't leave. American society is not adapted to that sort of thing. Borrowing and lending of money at interest is forbidden in Islamic law. So what would that rule out? Yeah.
Loans.
Yeah. Now there are ways around this. There are lending agencies, but they're not allowed to charge interest. There's all sorts of other things that they would have to do. But think about this. How many of you have these? Not this particular one, of course. How dependent are you in our current economy on the use of credit cards? They're awfully convenient, aren't they? Now imagine, strictly speaking, this is involving lending at interest, isn't it? Even if you get it at 0% interest for the introductory offer, blah, 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 blah. It never stays that way. So this would be something that would constitute a major obstacle. There are some places where, believe it or not, they don't take cash anymore, or checks, just credit cards. That could be an issue. Some of the other things that come up are sex roles, gender roles. Traditional Muslim culture is pretty male-centered. Women have a much smaller role. It varies from country to country. Interestingly, when I would teach this in world religions, I would bring in photographs of Muslim women in different countries. And in places like Saudi Arabia, you're going to see grown women covered from top to bottom. And it's not going to be different colors, it's all going to be black for the most part. In Afghanistan, under the Taliban, you have the burqas, but the burqas might actually be very different colors, some of them quite interesting. Other cases, just a headscarf. Some other cases, no covering at all. It varies depending on the culture and the country quite a bit. But there is still some sort of assertion of male roles and female roles being separate from each other, generally to the disadvantage of women. What else do we need to hit upon? I'm going to skip over some of the discussion about the structure of mosques. I do want to point out one thing in this chapter, though, that your book talks about as distinctively American, but probably also Western innovation, and that's Islamic community centers. You can find these in most large cities. And what is the purpose of these? Well, again, Islam is, in certain ways like Orthodox Judaism, like some more traditional forms of Christianity. It's an all-encompassing way of life. So it's not like just going off to, say prayers at the mosque on Friday and then, everything else is anything goes. The way it is for some Christians on, going to church on Sunday and then it's got no connection to the rest of their life. In North America, Muslims need a variety of institutional supports, educational facilities. Sort of like, think about Sunday school and the role of Sunday school. Recreational facilities. If they're to create a sense of community as a minority religious group intent on preserving values and traditions. And this brings us to something that's really interesting about American Islam. So, if you think about where you're going to find Islam in the world, and let's put aside the West for the moment, So we're not talking about North, South America, we're not talking about Europe. Where else are we going to find Muslims? Lots of Muslims. Yeah.
Like North Africa?
Mm-hmm.
And South Asia?
North Africa, so what we often call Sectarian Africa. And what ethnicity are the people in North Africa? Quite a few are Arabs, because the Arabs, spread out, conquered a lot of places. But what else? Yeah.
Lots of indigenous culture there have adopted Islam.
Yeah. And Islam has spread into what we call sub-Saharan Africa as well. So Nigeria is, largely Muslim in the north and largely Christian in the south, and it's been that way for quite some time. With Yoruba, traditional Yoruba religion sort of scattered mostly in the south because Islam has been recently more hostile to that. So black, Africans in Nigeria. Tuaregs, Mauritanians. Let's say we start going further east. Yeah.
Much of southern Asia, there's lots of Muslims.
Yeah.
Pakistan, Malaysia, lots of these places are majority Muslim.
So we have Malays who are ethnically distinct from Pakistanis, who are ethnically distinct from, the Bengalis in Bangladesh. That's why it's called Bangladesh. In Burma, Muslims are actually being persecuted by the majority Buddhists. They're Burmese Muslims. Where else? In the Middle East, of course, right? And a lot of Arabs in the Middle East, but a lot of other ethnicities as well. Yeah.
Europe, there are also Muslims. Albania is mostly Muslim.
Yeah, sort of an inheritance of the ones who are still Muslim after the communists have been in charge for a long time. But Kosovo, these places that used to be in the Ottoman Empire. Also all the stans, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, these stan nations, those mostly converted to Islam at one point or another, usually under Mongol rule. So, you know, if you go to an Islamic community center, you're going to see a lot of different ethnicities. What are the majority of converts in America? What ethnic group did they come from? Americans who were already here on the ground, not immigrants who converted to Islam. African American. And not just, you know, say Nation of Islam or Marist Science Temple, which are not considered Orthodox, but Sunni Islam, the American Muslim mission that was founded, you know, really what the Nation of Islam as such turned into. What we know as the Nation of Islam now is an offshoot of that. That's done a lot of outreach. So there's going to be a lot of diversity in any sort of Islamic community present today. Your book talks about some of the divisions in Islam, but it does it in very sort of, you know, big picture thumbnail ways. So I will mention it just because these are terms that are useful to know. But don't take what we're doing here as in any way an exhaustive study of these divisions. So the biggest division in Islam is between Sunni and Shiite. And Sunni are by far the majority of you know, Muslims in the world. About 85% of Muslims worldwide are Sunni Muslims. There are differences between different legal schools. There's 4 main legal schools, and that influences practice. There's differences between, you know, the way Islam is lived out in particular areas. But for the most part, you can say that there's you know, one large, not entirely homogenous, but, you know, connected community. The Shiites have always been a minority. The split between them took place almost, you know, immediately, you could say, within the Muslim community after the death of Muhammad, because the split had to do with who should be in charge, who should be the caliph, the successor to the prophet. And the Shiite held out for somebody who was actually related to him, so they wanted this guy Ali to be his successor. And the Sunni settled on another guy, Abu Bakr. And they went to war with each other. And, you know, usually when you're the smaller side in the war, how do you do? Not too well, right? And the Shiite found themselves getting pushed out. They were able to, you know, every once in a while sort of take control, but for the most part, they have been sort of pushed into the margins of the Islamic world. They did take over, you know, for example, Iran. Iraq is largely majority Shiite, at least in the, you know, parts that are ethnically Arab. And, you know, you'll find them in a few other places. They're divided into a couple different groups, the Twelvers, the Seveners. And then there's the Druze. The Druze are a very small group that are in the mountains of Lebanon. They're considered heterodox by everybody else. And we could add to this, you know, some of the other groups in America, like the Nation of Islam or Marist Science Temple, that are considered to be heterodox as well. Another thing that the Shiites really emphasize is martyrdom. You'll see them having passion plays, for example, commemorating the death of Ali and his sons. Then your book also talks about something else that I don't want you to mix up as like being a third group. Sufism, or Sufism. If one is a Sufi, this is the more ascetic practice within Islam, and traditionally it was brotherhoods. As a matter of fact, most of North Africa, south of the Sahara, was missionized by Sufis. Likewise for Central Asia, they carried out a lot of outreach, you could say, that had an incredible historical effect. Now, to be a Sufi means to take the 5 pillars very seriously, so seriously, in fact, that you might do more than a regular Muslim. So whereas you know, every Muslim is going to, say, pray 5 times a day, Sufis may pray 50 times a day. Whereas one might recite the Shahada once, they may recite it continuously. Whereas it's only incumbent upon Muslims to fast during the month of Ramadan, Sufis may fast their entire life. Restrict the, go without food altogether, but restrict the intake of food and drink. What else do we need to talk about? I guess the thing to close on, 9/11 was a real catalyst in many respects. Most Americans probably knew almost nothing about Islam before 9/11. In part because most Americans know almost nothing about most religions and most people. We suffer from what we call religious illiteracy. And so that sort of thrust it into the mainstream. And suddenly experts were on TV talking about Islam, doing all sorts of contradictory things. It's a religion of war, it's a religion of peace, this is what it means, this is what it means. And Americans have become, I would say in general, at least by my observation, somewhat better informed about the nature of Islam over the last, what is it now? 13 years. But only marginally so. It's also provoked a lot of self-scrutiny within the American Muslim community. The question was, who do you side with? The other thing that really provoked that too was, of course, the invasion of Iraq and the Iraq War, which by some was seen as a sort of a war on Islam. So your book talks about this as a process of collective self-definition, addressing consciously the issues of how they're perceived not only by outsiders, but by themselves. So American Islam is something that's, like a lot of these groups that we've studied, in process. It's not something that, we can make predictions about what it's going to look like 50 years from now. Here's one guaranteed prediction: there'll be more Muslims here in the United States now then than there are now. But it's very difficult to predict with any sort of certainty exactly where things are going to go. They're probably not going to look exactly the same as they do now, any more than now looks similar to, say, 1970. So that's it for Islam.